They told the limping nurse to stay back as the dust storm rolled across the desert outpost, her boot dragging slightly with every step, her left leg stiff from an old wound no one bothered to ask about, her uniform faded, sleeves rolled up, name tape barely readable, just, "Hail," nothing else, while officers barked orders and medics rushed past her as if she were part of the scenery, another broken thing in a broken place. And when the perimeter alarm sounded and the radio crackled with reports of incoming aircraft, a young lieutenant snapped at her to clear the landing zone, said this wasn't a place for charity cases or walking wounded, and she didn't argue, she never did, she just stepped back into the shadow of a supply crate, hand resting unconsciously on the silver chain around her neck, eyes narrowing as the sound grew louder, deeper. Not the whine of supply birds but the unmistakable thunder of Marine heavy-lift helicopters, 4 of them, flying in perfect formation through hostile airspace without escort, a move so aggressive the entire base froze, and when they touched down hard, rotors screaming, dust swallowing the compound, every ranking officer instinctively straightened, because nothing like this happened without reason, and then the radio went dead silent before a single voice cut through, calm, lethal, and absolute, requesting immediate confirmation of Angel 6, and confusion rippled across the command staff because no one on that base knew that call sign. No one except the nurse, whose grip tightened on the chain as memories slammed into her, night extractions under fire, blood-slick hands pulling soldiers back from death, a call sign whispered over encrypted channels when everything else had failed, and as the colonel demanded clarification, the voice repeated it, louder this time, stating they would not power down until Angel 6 was produced alive, and suddenly every eye turned, slowly, toward the limping nurse standing alone in the dust. Because the hardened Marine sergeant who exited the lead helicopter stopped dead the moment he saw her, removed his helmet, and dropped to one knee without hesitation, calling her by a rank no one there had ever heard attached to medical personnel, while behind him 3 more Marines followed suit, the colonel stammered, the lieutenant went pale, and the nurse, Angel 6, finally stepped forward, her limp still there, her presence suddenly massive, and as the rotors spun down she said quietly that she'd told them she was out, that she'd earned her peace, but if they'd flown 4 birds into hell just to find her, then someone out there was bleeding and scared and waiting, and she wasn't done yet, and as the Marines stood and cleared a path, the base realized too late that they hadn't been ignoring a broken nurse, they'd been standing next to a legend. They didn't tell her why at first, only that a recon platoon was trapped beyond the wire, surrounded, one man critical, comms degrading, air support denied due to civilian proximity, and when Angel 6 boarded the helicopter the Marines moved with a reverence usually reserved for flags draped over coffins, strapping her in gently, adjusting her gear without being asked, because they remembered her crawling through fire to reach them, remembered her voice steady while chaos screamed, remembered how she never carried a weapon yet somehow made men braver just by arriving, and as the bird lifted she stared out at the darkening horizon. Recalling the injury that gave her the limp, a night when extraction came too late and she stayed anyway, dragging wounded Marines one by one until a blast took her leg and nearly her life, the night command declared her Kia while she kept working in the dark, and when they reached the kill zone the situation was worse than reported, the platoon pinned in a ruined schoolhouse, enemies closing in, and Angel 6 didn't wait for a briefing, she was already moving, already inside, already pressing hands to wounds and issuing orders that seasoned staff sergeants obeyed without thinking, because she spoke the language of survival fluently, and when the critical Marine flatlined under her hands, she didn't stop, didn't accept it, she whispered his name like a promise and worked until his heart remembered its job, and when exfil finally came under fire and she was the last aboard, she turned back to grab a fallen Marine twice her size, dragging him with a leg that screamed in protest. Because quitting had never been an option, and back at base as dawn broke, the colonel approached her not with authority but awe, asking who she really was, and she answered simply that she was a nurse who refused to let her people die alone, and as word spread across the base and beyond, Angel 6 became a reminder that heroes don't always look the part, don't always stand straight or wear shiny medals, sometimes they limp, sometimes they're ignored, and sometimes the world only realizes who they are when 4 Marine helicopters land just to bring them back. The base didn't sleep that night, not after what they'd witnessed, not after watching Marines who'd faced war zones without flinching grow quiet and respectful whenever Angel 6 passed, because once the dust settled and the wounded were stabilized, stories began to surface in fragments, whispered at first, then spoken openly. How she had once stayed behind in a collapsed tunnel for 12 hours with a dying squad, rationing morphine, singing softly to keep them conscious while enemy boots echoed overhead, how she'd negotiated a ceasefire with nothing but a medic's patch and raw nerve to evacuate civilians, how commanders higher than anyone on that base had classified her operation so deeply that her existence had been erased for her own protection, and as the sun rose she sat alone on a crate outside the infirmary, rewrapping the brace on her leg with practiced fingers, exhaustion finally creeping in, when the Marine she'd revived, the one they said wouldn't make it, stepped out supported by 2 others, his face pale but alive, eyes locking onto her as if she were the reason gravity still worked, and he tried to salute, failed, laughed weakly, and thanked her for dragging him back when he was ready to let go, and she smiled gently, telling him that letting go wasn't allowed on her watch, but inside something shifted, because she'd told herself she was done, that the limp was her excuse, that anonymity was peace, yet here she was again, needed, remembered, called by a name that refused to stay buried, and when command requested her presence via encrypted channel, offering reinstatement, authority, resources, she didn't answer right away, instead watching the helicopters being refueled, their blades still scarred from the night's flight, knowing that somewhere else another Angel 6 call might come through, another voice shaking over the radio, and she understood then that being a legend wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about showing up when no one else could, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt, and as she finally stood, leaning slightly but unbroken, the Marines nearby straightened instinctively, not because of rank but because of respect. The message came just before dusk, not over open radio but through a secure tablet slid quietly across the infirmary desk, the kind of message that didn't ask, it summoned, and Angel 6 stared at the coordinates for a long moment, because she knew them, everyone who'd survived long enough did. A narrow valley unofficially called the funnel where patrols vanished and air support arrived too late, and the young medic beside her started to speak, started to say she didn't have to go, that someone else could handle it, but Angel 6 was already standing, already adjusting her gear, because she understood something the others were only beginning to learn. When the worst place on the map lit up, it meant someone was out there holding on by seconds, and the helicopters lifted again under a blood-red sky, rotors beating like a countdown. And when they landed this time there was no perimeter, no safe zone, only gunfire and smoke and shouting voices collapsing into panic, and Angel 6 moved through it with the calm of someone who had walked this edge before, dragging the wounded into cover, issuing sharp, simple commands that cut through fear, her limp slowing her but never stopping her, and when an explosion knocked her down and pain flared white-hot through her leg, she clenched her teeth, forced herself back up, because quitting wasn't written into her bones, and deep inside the valley she found the last survivor, a Marine barely conscious, clutching a radio that had failed hours earlier, who looked up at her in disbelief and whispered that he thought Angel 6 was a ghost, because command had said she was gone, and she squeezed his hand, told him ghosts didn't bleed, then carried him piece by piece toward extraction, every step a fight, every breath a decision, until the helicopters finally rose again, leaving silence behind them, and back at base as the night closed in, command made it official, not with medals or speeches but with a simple line added back into the system, Angel 6, active, and the nurse who once limped unnoticed across the tarmac now walked through the base with heads turning, not in curiosity but gratitude, because they understood now that survival sometimes wears a quiet face, and as she disappeared into the infirmary light once more, ready for the next call, remember this. Heroes don't announce themselves, they answer.